Lexi, so nice to see you again. We were joking that I would have this conversation independent of the conference, just the two of us. But before we dive in, I know that both JFF and your own personal experience on workforce predated sort of the COVID issues that we've seen, but it does feel like this is sort of a new moment in workforce development policy, and I wanted to just pose the question, sort of set the scene, kind of for you, what are those factors that are pushing this moment forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so nice to be in conversation with you. So I've said that when the pandemic hit us just about a year ago now, it felt very much like all the conversations so many of us in the policy arena have been having around the future of work and the implications of automation and changing economies and jobs just kind of like came down upon us all of a sudden. So it feels like this has really been an accelerant over the past year of the building of a lot of conversations about the different needs on reskilling and workforce development that we're going to have as a country. And I think when you look we're still very much in the midst of the health crisis and the economic crisis. And it feels like we are only maybe just starting to grapple with the impacts of the millions of Americans who have been unemployed at some point during this pandemic, the jobs that they may have had that aren't coming back or will come back in a different way, and what we need to do about that. And that really does feel like a national opportunity and a national challenge that we're facing right now.
That's I couldn't agree more. And I know you Workday, JFF. There's we all sort of interact with the same a number of stakeholders, whether it's Markle or the Business Roundtable or Aspen. And it feels like you and I were both on the Hill. Feels like part of our job is to assess that intelligence from the landscape. And it feels like to me everyone is sort of noticing this new moment. Are you feeling that that's shared by the stakeholders you're engaging with?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. It's, I think both for the stakeholders who have been working in workforce development and education policy for a long time, I think that there's a renewed energy amongst those organizations. But there are a lot of new entrants, right? There are a lot of either new organizations or organizations that maybe had a different focus and are kind of taking issues around training and workforce development into their bailiwick, which is exciting to see, and new coalitions forming amongst those organizations. And I think also new kind of interest and energy in philanthropy as well for diving into these issues.
That's great. So I'm channeling my inner Jimmy Kimmel. So I'm working on my segues. So that the new coalitions, the new entrants, obviously kind of the main headline is a new administration. So at the moment of this sort of new moment that we're in, we see the Biden administration take hold. So I wanted to just have you run down, I know it's early days, but what are you sort of seeing about the Biden administration's early priorities for workforce, for education policy that are catching your attention?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to remember that this administration is coming in under the shadow of this pandemic, right? First and foremost. And so a lot of what we are seeing in the early days is the grappling with that, right? So the administration has put together a COVID task force. Their first kind of big proposal they sent up to the Hill was around recovery and around addressing the pandemic. And so I think that a lot of things in kind of the immediate days have to be seen through that lens, that is really understandably the biggest challenge that they're seeing as they're coming in. And a lot of what they are putting out into the world is focused on recovery. And I think some of the different shades that we see within that are supports for individuals, right? So supports for those who are unemployed, additional financial supports for those who have had difficulty during the pandemic, health funding, obviously, but also funding to address the real education crisis we're experiencing right now around the number of schools that are still closed or operating in a different way, decreases in college enrollment, colleges kind of on the brink of closure. And so there's a lot of attention to those recovery issues. But I also think that there are a few things that stand out as you look at the Biden agenda from the campaign kind of through the transition that are also important to keep in mind. I think It has to be said that the community college focus that we expect from the administration should be pretty significant. Dr. Jill Biden is a community college professor herself, and I think we can expect to see a lot of interest and focus on community colleges as engines of recovery, right? So it connects back into the pandemic, but really looking at community colleges as a strong lever point for the administration. I also think a focus on career and technical education, a focus on pathways starting from an earlier age into high school, into middle school, building those out is something that the administration has clearly shown a lot of interest in. I think that a renewed or continued focus on apprenticeship, right? That's the sexy policy issue in a bipartisan way of the past, 5 years maybe. And that is clearly not stopping. That is continuing. And there are devils in the details around registered apprenticeship versus other kinds of apprenticeships. But that is probably the one policy that you could say the Trump administration was really into it and the Biden administration is going to be too. And I think finally in workforce development, it's another thing we're keeping an eye on is what the administration is thinking and looking at when it comes to issues around job quality, issues around labor issues. And I think you can already see kind of a focus on increasing the minimum wage, for example, within the recovery package. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on as well.
This transition is choppy. I'm just going to own it. That was great. When we were on, I'm sure you heard this on Capitol Hill. The 3 Ps. You have the people, the procedure, and the policy. So I want to dive down on the people for a minute. So part of an incoming administration, you've got the transition priorities, and then you've got sort of starting to think about what the early days workforce education priorities are. But key to that will be the people they put in place. So as you start to look at the partners that the Biden team has identified that are going to handle some of these issues, who's standing out to you? Who are you excited about working with? I'm not going to ask you the alternative to that of who are you excited to work with and who's standing out for you?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at kind of the early days and who's being brought into some of the key roles, I think we're seeing a lot of state and local leaders being placed in some of the key kind of secretary positions. You look at Mayor Marty Walsh as labor secretary, or you look at Governor Raimondo as commerce secretary. Those are interesting kind of pulling. That's a classic place that administration will look is to kind of state and local. But then I think the other really notable thing, and not surprising, is the number of former Obama era officials who are coming in as well. So when we look at the White House, we're seeing certainly a lot of folks who have worked with President Biden for many years. I think unlike, say, actually the Obama administration or certainly the Trump administration, Biden brings a big team with him. He's been in politics for many, many decades. So he has a deep well that he can turn to. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the staffing that's coming out of the White House with Ambassador Susan Rice as the head of the Domestic Policy Council, Carmel Martin, a longtime Obama-era aide, coming in to lead a new role of economic mobility within the Domestic Policy Council. And then I think also as you look kind of below the headline names that might be coming out, we're seeing those kind of similar trends for some of the additional political appointees across the agencies. A lot of kind of familiar faces from the Hill or from the Obama administration, but also some new faces, some new expertise. So it's a really, it's an exciting time. I think we're seeing a lot of deep expertise being brought into the agencies, which is something that is very heartening for us to see for sure.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. Certainly, Governor Raimondo bringing in some of her experience for skills for Rhode Island and the work that she did there. I also had the pleasure of hearing Carmel Martin and was pleased to hear sort of an open door on ideas like, hey, there's a lot of work that's got to be done. We're really open to creative thinking. I want to dive back to policy. I know that in the run up sort of to the inauguration, JFF provided some thoughts to the transition and continues to advise and help when it comes to sort of these early days. If you had all of those folks you just named in this virtual room, what would you want to highlight for them in terms of suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big messages that we are looking to relay to the administration, and that I think comes through in the blueprint, is that we're really focused on what's necessary to achieve an equitable economic recovery. And we think that that has to be done holistically. As you know, government operates in silos, right? Despite the fact that there are some very similar things that might happen at, say, the Department of Education or the Department of Labor when it comes to skills development, it's very hard to kind of bridge across. And what we see is the need to do that these are big challenges that we're facing as a country, and we can't do it in these like long-time silos that we've had. So what we put forward in our transition paper was to suggest that the administration focus on kind of people, on places, and on systems. That there's work that needs to be done to help people advance, whether that is, kind of getting them the training they need, figuring out how to finance that training, making sure that they have the wraparound supports that they need to actually be successful in that training. And that there's also a need to focus on inclusive regional economies and economic development. And that is, again, not something that is just one sector's job, but that is pulling together lots of different policies to think about how do you leverage opportunity zones in a different way? How do you think about an infrastructure bill, which we know is something that the Biden administration and Congress are both interested in, that is an opportunity not just to build roads, but to really build communities in a different way and to train people while you do it. And then finally, the systems change that I think JFF has worked on for a long time. It's an opportunity to revamp education and workforce development systems from the federal level to then kind of trickle down below there. So what I think my overarching advice is to not just think of these as little pieces, but to think of them as the way that they interact and to work across agencies and work across kind of traditional silos to solve the problems together.
I want to compliment the memo in its sort of depth and breadth. Definitely a 360 view. A few of the concepts, the National Career Navigation System, that idea of sort of, not only what skills do I have, but what skills can I grow, and where can that take me? That's something I think a lot of folks are talking about. That focus on skills-based education. That that part of that new moment that I feel like we're in is sort of a recognition of agility and how do we move people quickly into new roles based on what they know how to do. All super great ideas. I'll channel a piece here. I won't ask you you can just sort of remain ambivalent. There has been some frustration in sort of COVID relief efforts up until now that some of the needs that have been addressed have been the more, I'm going to put this in the most, the gentlest way possible. Some of the needs that have been addressed have been the most pressing needs at the moment, while some of the workforce development pieces maybe have been pushed to the sort of the next phase. So I'm assuming when you're talking about some of this that you're looking past the rescue package and to the recover package. Is that what you're thinking?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and we totally are on the same page. We have been, I would say, disappointed by the lack of a focus on the recovery element of this. I think even in looking at the proposal that President Biden has put forward, there still is not the level of investments. It's about, as you said, kind of relief, right? How are we kind of keeping the lights on? How are we keeping things going? Versus really making some of those shifts and investments in longer term recovery. There's a bill that Congress introduced last spring called the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, or RAWA, which is a terrible name. But it's a great bill, and it would have significant investments into the workforce system. And so we're hopeful that those conversations will continue and that there will be the kind of continued opportunity to think about making investments and making reforms and kind of revitalizations into existing systems and structures that are going to be needed to take on this challenge.
You and I both time on the Hill. I'm sure you've already identified if you've got the one quiver in your arrow. You're probably doomed for some disappointment. So we are looking out. We were close to a higher ed reauthorization. Maybe some interest in that. WIOA, certainly, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act is coming up for reauthorization. Plus, there's the natural appropriations process. So, are you looking at sort of the whole waterfront for moving good ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before COVID hit, it did feel like there was some momentum, bipartisan momentum, to look at the Higher Education Act, to look at WIOA, and I think that is probably not on the short term agenda for Congress, but we hope that it is in the not too long term agenda. So I used to work for an appropriator when I was in the Senate, so I love doing things through appropriations and through funding. But even I will acknowledge that you hit a barrier at a certain point, that there are changes that need to be made that you just can't do without really opening back up some of these underlying bills that are setting up our federal structures and making the changes that you need to them. You can kind of push a little ways and you can make some good improvements, but there's more. So I definitely hope that those will be back on the table later this year.
So we've covered the people, we've covered the policy. Now let's talk a little bit about the process. And when you and I talked a little bit about this before, you referred to this as the wet blanket portion of the conversation. Clearly, the Biden administration is taking has taken the White House reins. The Georgia elections delivered this Democrats into the majority in the Senate. You could sort of, with a glass half full, look at this and say, unified government, this is going to be great. But I think both you and I have identified some challenges there. What's top of mind in terms of challenges for you?
Yeah, I think it's hard to emphasize enough how tight that Senate majority is. That the reality of running a 50-50 Senate majority means that you can only act, the Democratic Party in the Senate can only act in a way that makes their most conservative member feel comfortable, right? You just don't have any give. And if you are looking to do something like most legislation that requires 60 votes, you also need to go find 10 Republicans to come along with you. And as the country has gotten and the parties have gotten more polarized, that has become increasingly difficult. So I think that's why, if you're kind of listening to the chatter, there are a lot of calls from progressive party activists, many senators, to do away with the filibuster, or to use other tools to enable getting things done on just a pure majority vote. That is complicated and still feels kind of far away, and I think for Senate institutionalists seems very challenging to wrap the mind around. But I think that there is this pressure to get things done quickly, and I think the fact that there are so many Obama veterans within the Biden administration means that you have a lot of people who reflect back on the period of time when there was unified government when Obama was president and see missed opportunities and see too much time spent trying to negotiate in a bipartisan way, and maybe are this time looking at trying to push those boundaries faster. And I think that's why what we've seen over the past week or so, 2 weeks, is Congress already setting up a process to pass the president's recovery package on just a baseline majority. I'm not going to go full wonk and get into all the details of what is called budget reconciliation. I'm not going to do it.
I was going to say, I'll give you $1 every time you said the word bird in the last 2 weeks.
There are bird rules. There are votoramas. We have many fond memories of extremely late nights spent in the Senate office buildings working our way through those. But it's basically a tool, in short, that the Senate can deploy for bills that are just about money, right? So it's about raising money, it's about spending money, it's not about kind of the details underneath. And so that is a tactic that can be deployed in a limited fashion. So I think we'll see that happen. I think that there will also continue to be pressure on figuring out what to do with the filibuster, especially if we see kind of the Republican Party in the Senate not moving forward with things. So I think it's a challenging time beyond what kind of the headline party identifications might look like.
I couldn't agree more. And one small, maybe not small, a silver lining is if you pull back the aperture and look at the leaders we have that are addressing those challenges, in some ways they're best in class. I mean, you have Majority Leader Schumer. He's been at this a long time. If there's a deal to be cut, he's in the middle of it. And so tall challenge, but pretty same. Speaker Pelosi's been at this a long time and very experienced. Pretty tight margin in the House too, and a broad broad caucus interests that she's going to have to figure out how to span. But if there's anyone that can do it, she's sort of been there. I want to flag and sort of ask you, the Help Committee, Chairwoman Murray, Ranking Member Burr, and then on the House side, some same old faces. Are you feeling optimistic about sort of the institutional knowledge, at least in this challenging time for a process that could be brought to bear?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a good point, which is that there are some very savvy political and policy operators in a lot of these key positions. And I think that it's also important you definitely should not discount President Biden's long history himself in the Senate, his relationships that he has across the aisle there with many members who are still in place. So I think it should not be thrown out that compromise might be possible in ways that people might not see right now. I think also the political wins are a little hard to fully put a finger on right now because it's been such a disruptive time. But I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think in addition to the members, we've also, at least for now, and it could change, have some relative consistency in terms of some of the key staff in some of those positions. That sometimes you see big shakeups, especially when there's a new administration with a lot of staff departing. Some of them have, but there are a lot of staff, at least for now, that are kind of sticking around. And those are, as you know, ultimately the folks who have to ink the paper and help their bosses get the deals done.
So I've hogged all of the question time. We do have a question in the chat that I'm going to turn to now. I can fill the rest of your afternoon. But so Lexi talked a little bit about what we can hope for and expect in terms of meaningful impacts from policy changes for workers and learners. But where's that going to fall short, and where are others like companies going to need to step up and fill gaps?
Great question. Policy always falls short, doesn't it? It just always does. And I say that as a policy person, that the policy, especially federal policy, is just a really, really giant hammer. And you have these tiny, tiny little nails, and you're just doing your best. You're doing your best to create the right set of incentives and the right set of rules. But inevitably, it is either made or broken on the implementation of that policy and the ecosystem that is working to kind of row in the same direction. And I think that to take it to a completely different area, but K through 12 policy, right? You look at the entirety of the No Child Left Behind era, and you went from a very popular, very bipartisan policy that had a lot of governors in support and a lot of kind of real activation behind. That was almost as bipartisan of something as you could possibly get. And then within a decade, it was anathema to everybody. But it was the same policy, right? It was the same policy. So I think that the policy is what the people on the ground and the people who are interacting with it are making of it. So I think that there's tremendous need for, you talked about some of the skills-based recommendations that we're putting forward. I think there's a lot that policymakers can do to help make it easier to reform kind of the rules around competency-based education, to think about federal hiring differently, to kind of push in the direction of moving more towards skills and less to kind of just a pure degree-based approach. But that will only go so far, and companies are the ones who ultimately are going to be making those choices and implementing those decisions. So I think when policy is working well, it's really working in concert with all of the other players together. We're
That's a great answer. And I wish I could take credit for that question, because that was a good question. We're about at time. I'm going to take one Jimmy Kimball point of personal privilege. And ask you about to spend just a minute or two. You had the opportunity to be a navigator for the Secretary of Education. That, from again going full policy wonk, is fascinating to me. Can you just share an impression or two on what that experience was like?
Sure. Yeah. So in my free time, which is minimal, but expanded somehow to fit the needs. In my free time over the past 6 weeks or so, I have been a navigator for Dr. Cardona's nomination for Secretary of Education, which has been really exciting. It's basically helping him navigate the Senate meetings, the Senate confirmation process, and just being kind of the insider person to make sure that he's getting where he needs to go. It has been very different. This is my first transition. It's been very different than I imagined it would be in regular times, because this was all, other than the hearing, everything was virtual. But it's been a really great honor to have the opportunity to do that. And from just having that line of sight into the transition, I was amazed by the apparatus that was put together and to kind of set the administration off on a strong foot. So it's been an exciting opportunity, and though I'm grateful to be coming back to JFF.
That is fascinating. I've just been on the receiving end of those meetings where the folks in Europe just sort of knew knew everything that was going on and figures on the web, and so that's great. It shows to me that we're just about at time. I'm going to flip back to see if there's any last minute questions in the chat, and otherwise I'm going to ask you if you have any closing thoughts to share.
No, this was fun. I'm only disappointed that it was billed as after hours, but it's at 4:30, and so I didn't feel like I could have a beer or another beverage while we were having this conversation, but I look forward to doing that in the future.